They say you can't own nature, but she sure tried. 60 cabins, a floating restaurant, a shiny new name for the lake my grandfather spent his whole life protecting. Clarice Vaughn thought money paperwork and a smile that never reached her eyes would be enough to erase history. She had no clue who she was messing with, or what this place is capable of when it decides enough is enough. Have you ever seen someone go too far, thinking no one would stop them? I'd honestly love to hear your story down in the comments. I'm Roy Callan, and I thought I knew everything there was to know about Lake Haven. After all, I'd spent 15 years managing the dam operations for this exact water system before taking early retirement. The lake wasn't just my job, it was my inheritance passed down from my grandfather, who built his log cabin right on the shoreline back in the 1950s. I thought retirement by the lake meant fishing and peace. Clearly, I misjudged. Looking back, I should have known peace never lasts when money gets involved. That Tuesday morning started like any other. I grabbed my tackle box and headed out for some early bass fishing, the mist still hanging over the water like a soft gray blanket. But as I rounded the bend near the old pine grove, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Construction signs. Huge professional signs everywhere I looked. Lake Haven, Luxury Estates 60, Premium Rental Cabins, Grand Opening, Summer 2024. 60 cabins, not 10, not 20, but 60 vacation rentals around what used to be pristine shoreline. Who builds 60s anything around a quiet family lake? The signs weren't just advertising cabins either. There was going to be a marina, a floating restaurant, and something called a waterfront event center. I stared at those words until they started swimming together. An event center on my lake, the lake where my grandfather taught me to read water and weather, was about to become a commercial playground. I wasn't sure if I was overreacting, but this felt like someone announcing they were going to build a shopping mall in my living room. I tied up my boat and marched straight to the HOA office, which was really just a converted garage behind the community center. Clarice Vaughn, all sharp heels and sharper intentions, barely glanced at me when I walked in. She was typing on her laptop like she was composing a symphony, completely ignoring me standing there, with mud on my boots and probably steam coming out of my ears. When she finally looked up, she had this smile that didn't reach her eyes, the kind of smile that said she was already 3 steps ahead of whatever complaint I was about to make. "Mr. Callan, isn't it? What can I do for you this morning? You can explain to me what the hell 60 vacation cabins are doing around my family's lake," I said, and honestly, I wish I could tell you I kept my voice calm and reasonable. But come on, who wouldn't be upset? Clarice's smile got even wider, which somehow made it more terrifying. She reached into a filing cabinet and pulled out a thick folder, laying out documents with the ease of someone who'd done this before. "This lake will become the crown jewel of our vacation rental empire," she said, barely glancing at the papers. "As for you, Mr. Callan, you'll either embrace the changes or find somewhere quieter to live." Did she really just call my family's lake her crown jewel? I actually had to stop and stare at her after that one. Here's where things got really twisted. Clarice explained in that sickeningly sweet voice that she'd been secretly buying up all the lakefront property for 6 months using different company names. Limited liability corporations, shell companies, the whole 9 yards, basically every trick in the book to hide what she was really doing. While I'd been enjoying my peaceful retirement, thinking I was living in a quiet community of like-minded people, this woman had been plotting to turn Lake Haven into some kind of vacation rental empire. She'd used names like Serenity Holdings LLC and Tranquil Waters Development to purchase properties, making it look like different investors instead of one master plan. "It's all perfectly legal," she said, sliding a business card across the desk, with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no in her entire life. "We've followed every zoning law and environmental regulation. The planning board approved our proposal unanimously." I looked at that business card, Vaughn Development Group, and felt something cold settle in my stomach. This wasn't just some crazy idea. This was a full-scale operation, and I'd been completely blindsided. The woman had been playing chess while I was still figuring out the rules of checkers. Walking back to my cabin, I felt like I was seeing the lake for the first time, or maybe the last time at least, the way it had always been. The morning mist had burned off, and the water was that perfect mirror calm that made you forget there was a world beyond the tree line. Loons were calling from the far shore, and a great blue heron stood motionless in the shallows. In a few months, this would all be gone. replaced by jet skis and floating restaurants and God knows what else. The thought made me physically sick. Maybe I should have just accepted it, found somewhere else to retire, let Clarice have her victory, and moved on with my life. But then I remembered something my grandfather used to say while we sat on that same dock watching the sunset. Some things are worth fighting for, even when you know you might lose. That's when I stopped at my old dam control station, a small concrete building hidden behind a grove of pine trees that most people drove past without noticing. I still had the keys from my 15 years as operations manager. They'd never bothered to collect them when I took early retirement, probably figuring the new guy would handle everything. Inside were all my original water flow maps and engineering notes, covered in dust, but still perfectly legible, like a treasure map to secrets that only I understood. I spread them out on the old metal desk and studied the intricate network of channels, valves, and flow controls that most people didn't even know existed. These weren't just technical drawings. They were 15 years of knowledge about how this lake really worked, how water moved through underground channels, how pressure built up during storms, how nature had designed this system long before humans showed up with their construction plans. Clarice Vaughn might think she owned this lake now, but she had no idea what she was really dealing with. Looking at those technical drawings, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger exactly, but something colder and more determined. Lady, I thought you picked the wrong lake, and you definitely picked the wrong guy to mess with. The harassment started exactly 3 days later, like Clarice had been sitting in her office with a calendar marking off days until she could start making my life miserable. I found an official HOA violation notice taped to my front door, typed on letterhead, that looked more expensive than most people's wedding invitations. Improper waterfront maintenance was the main charge, which apparently meant my fishing dock and tackle box didn't meet their new aesthetic standards. They wanted a $500 fine plus a written compliance plan explaining how I intended to improve the visual appeal of my property. I read that notice twice trying to figure out if this was some kind of joke. My grandfather built that dock in 1962, and it had weathered every storm for over 60 years. I realized this was psychological warfare, pure and simple. Clarice was trying to make my life so miserable that I'd give up and move away, leaving her free to transform the entire lake without any annoying longtime residents complaining about noise and traffic. The problem was it was actually starting to work. Within a week, I noticed people treating me differently. Neighbors who had waved every morning for 3 years suddenly found reasons to look the other way when they saw me coming. Mrs. Henderson from down the road, who used to stop and chat about the weather, now practically jogged past my driveway. It didn't make sense at the time, but I found out later that Clarice had been busy spreading poison about my employment history. Here's where it got really twisted. According to Clarice's version of events, I'd been terminated for safety violations during my dam management career. Complete and total lies, but apparently effective ones. She was telling anyone who would listen that I was some kind of reckless hothead who couldn't be trusted with a water faucet, let alone critical infrastructure. 15 years I'd kept that water system running perfectly, preventing floods, managing seasonal water levels, maintaining equipment that most people couldn't even identify. I'd received commendations from the County Safety Awards recognition for my dedication to protecting the community. Now she was painting me as an incompetent madman who'd been fired for endangering public safety. Earl Simmons was the one who told me what people were saying. Earl was my elderly neighbor, probably 73 years old, who'd lived around the lake for decades and wasn't impressed by Clarice's expensive suits and smooth talk. "Roy," he said, shaking his weathered head, "that woman's got people believing you were some kind of dangerous lunatic who couldn't be trusted with a garden hose, let alone a dam system." I decided to fight back through legal channels, which seemed like the reasonable thing to do at the time. Maybe I was being naive, thinking that facts and truth would matter in a system designed to favor whoever had the most money. Logan Pierce was a fresh law school graduate who'd just opened a practice in town, probably 26 years old, and looked like he still got carded at restaurants. But he listened to my story and got genuinely angry on my behalf. Logan was idealistic in the way that only young lawyers can be, still believing that the legal system worked for regular people instead of just protecting the wealthy. "This is exactly the kind of corporate bullying that gives development a bad name," he said, spreading papers across his desk, with the enthusiasm of someone who still thought justice was possible. Earl rallied old families. Logan prepared the argument. I brought the only thing that might still matter: proof. The lake couldn't handle Clarice's vision. We filed a formal complaint with the town planning board and started collecting signatures from residents who opposed the massive development. Even Dave from 2 cabins down, the one I helped fix a gutter for, had signed their petition. That one stung. The public hearing was scheduled for a Thursday evening in the high school auditorium, and I thought we had a real chance. We had environmental concerns, traffic impact studies that Logan had researched, and testimony from people who had lived here long enough to remember what the lake was like before development pressure started building. We walked into that auditorium feeling like David facing Goliath, but at least we had our slingshot ready and stones in our pocket. Looking back, I should have known we were walking into an ambush. Clarice walked in trailing luxury and certainty, with a presentation that looked like it cost more than my annual retirement income. Professional slideshows, economic impact studies, artist renderings of the luxury lakefront community she was planning to create that made it look like some kind of paradise instead of the commercial disaster it really was. She talked about job creation and tax revenue and bringing Lake Haven into the 21st century, while her lawyers nodded and took notes like she was delivering the Gettysburg Address. The planning board members were practically drooling over her profit projections and construction timelines, dollar signs reflecting in their eyes as they imagined the tax revenue flowing into town coffers. When Logan stood up to present our opposition case, you could feel the energy in the room shift. Suddenly, we weren't concerned citizens exercising our democratic rights. We were obstacles to progress, stubborn old-timers standing in the way of economic growth. The vote was 5-0 in favor of the project. 5-0. Not even one dissenting voice or request for additional environmental studies or acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, 60 vacation cabins might be too many for a quiet family lake. Clarice didn't even acknowledge me as she packed up her materials and walked out, her heels clicking on the auditorium floor like a countdown timer, marking the end of the lake as I'd always known it. I sat there watching the planning board members shake hands and felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. So much for legal channels, so much for reasonable discourse and environmental concerns and the rights of longtime residents. Money talks and everything else is just background noise. That night, I copied the water pressure logs to a flash drive. Maybe legal routes had failed, but nature, she still listened to me. I knew the paths. I didn't need the maps anymore. The next morning, I decided it was time to visit something most people didn't know existed: an old water flow regulation system, deep in the woods that I'd used during my 15 years as dam manager. These weren't the main dam controls that everyone could see from the road, but a series of manual valves and underground channels that helped manage seasonal water levels and prevent flooding during heavy spring rains. The system was built back in the 1970s when engineers actually understood that you work with nature instead of trying to conquer it with concrete and steel. I'm not even sure why the county never updated their records when they built these controls, but honestly, their bureaucratic oversight was about to become Clarice's very expensive problem. Earl came with me partly because he was curious about what I was planning, and partly because he was probably worried I might be losing my mind. "Roy," he said, as we pushed through the underbrush, stepping over fallen logs and ducking under low-hanging branches, "please tell me you're not about to flood half the lake over a grudge. This isn't you." I had to laugh at that. Earl was 73 years old and had the kind of practical wisdom you only get from living through decades of other people's stupidity. He'd seen enough small-town politics to know when someone was getting screwed, and he wasn't the type to just sit back and watch it happen. "I'm not destroying anything," I explained, holding back a branch so he could pass. "I'm just restoring the water flow to how it naturally operated before they started digging." That was the truth, too. Clarice's construction crew had accidentally disrupted several underground springs when they cleared land for building-blocking natural drainage patterns with their heavy machinery and fill dirt. They'd basically thrown a wrench into a system that had been working perfectly for thousands of years, then acted surprised when water started behaving in ways their fancy engineers couldn't predict. The control station was exactly where I'd left it, hidden behind a screen of pine trees and overgrown with wild raspberry bushes that made it invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The metal housing was rusty but intact, and my old combination lock still worked after 3 years of retirement. Inside were the manual valves I'd used to redirect underground springs feeding into Lake Haven. Earl watched me check the valve positions and water pressure readings, making notes in the same waterproof notebook I'd carried for 15 years. The readings told a story that only someone with my experience could understand: underground pressure building up behind blockages created by construction, natural channels trying to flow but being diverted in directions that created instability in the soil foundation. "You sure you remember how this all works?" Earl asked, watching me adjust settings with the confidence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. But muscle memory is a strange thing. My hands moved across those valves, like I'd been working on them yesterday, adjusting flow rates and pressure settings according to seasonal variations I'd memorized decades ago. This system was meant for spring storms. I was just giving it a reason. I made a few careful adjustments, nothing dramatic or destructive, just restoring the underground flow patterns to how they'd operated, before Clarice's crew started digging and blocking natural channels with their construction debris. Earl kept asking if I was sure about what I was doing, and honestly, I wasn't completely sure about anything anymore. But I knew water, and I knew this lake, and I knew that some things are worth taking a stand for, even when you can't predict the exact consequences. The results were immediate and spectacular. The next morning, Clarice's construction workers arrived to find their foundation holes slowly filling with groundwater, like the earth was gently but persistently rejecting their plans. It was a beautiful sunny day, no rain in the forecast, but water kept seeping up from below, like the land was crying tears of protest. I watched from my fishing boat, staying far enough away to avoid suspicion, but close enough to see what was happening. They looked like kids trying to fix a sinking sandbox. The construction foreman was on his radio, trying to explain to someone, probably Clarice, that they had a drainage problem they couldn't figure out, despite all their engineering degrees and expensive equipment. "Ma'am, we've got water coming up through the foundation sites, and our pumps can't keep up with it. It's like the ground is spring-loaded or something. We're going to need industrial equipment to handle this volume." Ever seen someone ignore every warning and still act shocked when things fall apart? Tell me below. Clarice arrived at the construction site about an hour later, stepping out of her white Mercedes like she was posing for a magazine cover, probably thinking she could solve with money and attitude what her engineers couldn't fix with pumps and drainage pipes. She picked her way across the muddy ground in heels that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, demanding answers from her workers about soil issues and drainage problems, like she could intimidate the laws of physics into submission. I could hear her voice carrying across the water, getting higher and more frustrated, as her workers tried to explain that the water was coming from underground sources they couldn't identify or control. Watching her perfect composure start to crack was more satisfying than I'd expected. This wasn't revenge exactly, it was just the land reminding her how water actually works when you don't have 15 years of experience managing natural systems. What really got to me was how completely clueless she seemed about the natural forces she was trying to improve. Clarice kept pointing at blueprints and architectural drawings like they were holy scripture, insisting that her engineers must have miscalculated something that could be fixed with better planning or more expensive equipment. But you can't miscalculate nature. You can't engineer your way around underground springs that have been flowing since the last ice age. You can't build 60 vacation cabins on wetland soil and expect the earth to just accept it quietly without fighting back. I stayed out there in my boat for most of the morning, watching expensive machinery try to pump out water that kept rising from below like a slow-motion rebellion, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years: the deep satisfaction of knowing exactly what you're doing while everyone else scrambles around in confusion. By afternoon, I could hear Clarice on her phone from across the lake, her voice echoing off the water as she paced back and forth between flooded foundation holes. "I don't care what it costs. Bring in industrial pumps and fix this drainage problem. We have investors flying in next week." That's when I realized she was doubling down instead of backing off, throwing more money and equipment at a problem she didn't understand, instead of stopping to consider that maybe, just maybe, the lake was trying to tell her something important. Maybe I'd underestimated how stubborn she really was, or maybe I'd underestimated how much money she was willing to lose before admitting that some battles can't be won with checkbooks and construction crews. Either way, watching her pace back and forth in those ridiculous heels, gesturing frantically at flooded foundation holes, while her workers shrugged helplessly, I knew this was just the opening move in a much larger game. Despite the ongoing foundation problems that would have made any reasonable person reconsider their entire project, Clarice pushed forward with construction like she was personally at war with the laws of physics and determined to win through sheer force of will. She brought in bigger pumps, deeper drainage systems, and engineers who charged by the hour to tell her what I could have explained for free, that you don't build on wetland soil without accepting some serious consequences. But Clarice Vaughn wasn't the type to admit mistakes or change course based on inconvenient realities like geology and hydrology. Before the grand opening, I made one more quiet move. Sent Clarice's investors an anonymous tip about unstable groundwater. Nothing illegal, just a weather report with red circles and arrows. Let them wonder. Instead, she scheduled a grand opening celebration for her new floating event platform, inviting local VIPs, potential investors, and news media to see her luxury lakefront vision come to life in all its expensive glory. I have to admit, watching her double down on this disaster was like watching someone insist they could stop a freight train with positive thinking and expensive marketing materials. The weather forecast for that weekend was calling for severe thunderstorms, the kind of spring weather system that had been flooding this area since before anyone kept records or built fancy lakefront developments. I monitored my old weather tracking equipment and watched the radar patterns with the same attention I'd given them during my 15 years managing dam operations, reading atmospheric pressure and storm cell development, like a language most people never learned. This was going to be a big one: heavy rainfall, high winds, and the kind of sustained precipitation that turned gentle streams into raging torrents and made normally peaceful lakes behave in ways most people never saw. Clarice either didn't know how to read weather reports or didn't care about minor details like natural disasters because she sent out invitations promising perfect conditions for waterfront dining and entertainment. Looking back, I should have warned her about what was coming, but honestly, would she have listened to the crazy old guy she'd been slandering around town? Meanwhile, several longtime lake residents had organized their own response to Clarice's grand opening, a peaceful boat protest that turned out to be more effective than any legal challenge we could have mounted. It wasn't exactly my idea, but I joined them anyway, puttering around in my old aluminum boat, while her guests tried to enjoy cocktails on the floating platform that was already starting to list slightly from uneven weight distribution. Earl brought his ancient outboard motor that sounded like a chainsaw having an argument with a garbage disposal, and watching him circle that fancy platform while dressed in his fishing overalls was better entertainment than anything Hollywood could produce. The contrast was perfect: local residents who actually understood the lake versus wealthy outsiders who saw it as nothing more than a profit opportunity with a scenic backdrop. The other protesters included the Richardsons in their old pontoon boat, the Kowalskis with their canoe, and several other families who'd been coming to this lake for decades and understood what we were about to lose forever. We weren't being aggressive or disruptive, just quietly circling the celebration, like a reminder that some people actually lived here year-round and cared about more than property values and tax revenue. The news cameras loved it local color for their story about development and community resistance, the kind of human interest angle that makes for good television. But what the cameras didn't capture was the weather system building on the horizon, dark clouds massing like an army preparing for battle. While Clarice gave her speech about bringing prosperity to our underutilized natural resources, she raised her champagne, announced a new era for Lake Haven, and the crowd applauded. I actually thought for a second she might get away with it. As Clarice's celebration reached its peak with her giving a confident speech about luxury lakefront living to potential investors who were probably already calculating their return on investment, I quietly made my way to the main dam control station. The floating platform was packed with people in expensive clothes, holding wine glasses and nodding appreciatively as Clarice painted her vision of turning our quiet lake into some kind of vacation rental empire. You ever watch someone dig their own grave and decorate it too? Let me know in the comments. This one came with hors d'oeuvres. I still had my master keys and 15 years of operational knowledge, and I knew exactly what needed to be done, according to the standard flood control procedures. This wasn't sabotage or revenge. It was following the exact same safety protocols I'd used dozens of times during severe weather events. The timing was perfect just as the weather system reached peak intensity, sending sheets of rain across the lake and turning the calm water into a churning mess of whitecaps and wind-driven waves. I opened the gates according to water pressure readings and storm intensity forecasts, following procedures I'd used for 15 years to protect this community from flooding. Within minutes, the combination of opened floodgates, heavy rainfall, and blocked natural drainage from months of construction created exactly the kind of flooding event I'd prevented dozens of times during my career. Except this time, I wasn't trying to prevent it. I was just letting nature demonstrate what happens when you don't show proper respect for forces that have been shaping this landscape for millions of years. The results were absolutely spectacular. Clarice's floating platform started tilting as the current picked up, sending elegant buffet tables sliding toward the water like small boats abandoning a sinking ship. VIP guests in formal wear slipped and slid through ankle-deep mud, clutching champagne glasses and trying to maintain their dignity while the sound system shorted out with sparks and crackling noises that added a perfect soundtrack to the chaos. The mayor's wife ended up sitting in a puddle, her expensive dress soaked through and her carefully styled hair hanging in wet strings, while the county commissioner tried to wade to shore in leather shoes that were probably worth more than most people's car payments. Tablecloths floated like surrender flags. One man lost his shoe to the current. The lake didn't roar, it whispered, "I was here first." She barked orders like a general losing a war mascara streaking down one cheek, heels sinking into the mud she couldn't command. Her perfect blonde hair was plastered to her head. Her expensive suit was covered in lake water and mud, and her face had gone from confident hostess to complete bewilderment in about 10 minutes. The look of absolute shock and confusion in her eyes as her guests abandoned the event like rats leaving a sinking ship was worth every legal problem that was probably coming my way. I stayed hidden in the tree line watching her expensive marketing event turn into a disaster movie, and felt something I hadn't experienced since my grandfather taught me to fish, the deep satisfaction of seeing natural justice in action. Welcome to the real Lake Haven Clarice. This is how she behaves when you don't show proper respect for what you're dealing with. The next morning, I woke up to find security cameras pointed directly at my cabin, like electronic eyes watching for any suspicious movement, and a legal notice taped to my front door that looked more official and threatening than anything I'd ever seen. The letterhead read, "Criminal Investigation, Willful Property Damage." And seeing those words in formal legal print made my stomach drop, even though I had been expecting this moment since I opened those floodgates. I knew Clarice wouldn't just accept defeat quietly, especially not after being humiliated in front of investors and news cameras, but holding that notice in my hands made the whole situation suddenly real in a way it hadn't been before. Found out the new guy at the bait shop, the one I'd hired last summer, had been sending photos of my cabin to Clarice. Said he thought it was just zoning stuff. I told him to keep the change and lose my number. Clarice's lawsuit arrived 3 days later, delivered by a process server who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world than my front porch. She was suing me for millions in property damage, armed with security footage that supposedly showed me tampering with critical dam infrastructure and recklessly endangering public safety. The legal language was impressive and terrifying. Willful destruction of private property, reckless endangerment of public safety, intentional interference with lawful business operations. Reading through that lawsuit was like being punched in the stomach repeatedly by someone wearing legal gloves, each page detailing how my actions had supposedly caused irreparable harm to her business and endangered the lives of innocent people. Logan Pierce spent an entire afternoon going through the charges, explaining how each one could potentially send me to prison or bankrupt me for life. The security footage was the real problem, and it had been edited more carefully than a Hollywood thriller. They cut context like a film editor, with an agenda kept, the guilt sliced the reason. In their version of events, I was a dangerous madman who'd opened critical valves during a severe storm, putting lives at risk and causing millions of dollars in damage to legitimate business operations. They'd removed the weather reports, the water pressure readings, the atmospheric conditions that justified every single decision I'd made. What remained was footage of me working on dam controls with no explanation of why, no context for the approaching storm, no indication that I was following procedures I'd used successfully for 15 years. Logan watched the edited footage with me pausing and rewinding sections that made me look especially guilty or unhinged. But Logan was smarter than his young appearance suggested, and he'd been doing research that Clarice's expensive lawyers had apparently overlooked in their rush to destroy me. Logan looked up from the paperwork, eyes burning. If we can prove her engineers ignored the flood zone reports, we've got something stronger than defense, we've got negligence. For a moment, I believed him. Buried in county records that required hours of digging through bureaucratic filing systems, he found that Clarice's construction plans were based on outdated geological surveys from the 1980s that were about as reliable as weather predictions from the same era. My original engineering reports, which I'd personally signed and filed, during my 15 years as dam manager, clearly stated that the land was unsuitable for dense construction due to underground water channels and seasonal flooding patterns that any competent engineer should have taken into account. The county had these reports on file gathering dust in some basement archive, but somehow they'd been conveniently overlooked during the planning approval process. "Roy," Logan said, spreading the documents across his desk, like evidence in a murder case. Either this was deliberate negligence or criminal incompetence on someone's part, maybe both. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in district court, and I showed up wearing the only suit I owned, a navy blue thing I'd bought for my retirement party 3 years earlier and hadn't worn since. Clarice arrived with her team of expensive lawyers, looking like she was personally financing a small law firm dedicated to my destruction. The courtroom felt like hostile territory, with her legal team occupying one side like an invading army, while Logan and I sat alone at the defendant's table. We weren't a legal team. We were two stubborn fools holding up a dam with duct tape and guts. When the judge asked me to explain my actions, I spoke as plainly and honestly as I could, the way I'd learned to communicate during 15 years of explaining technical decisions to people who didn't understand water management. "Your Honor, I didn't open anything that wasn't designed to be opened during storm conditions. I followed the same flood control procedures I'd used successfully for 15 years to protect this community from flooding. When I opened those gates, I did what my grandfather would have done. Protect the land, not the plans. He didn't leave me a lake. He left me a promise." The judge was an older man who had probably seen enough small-town legal battles to recognize when someone was being railroaded by money and influence, and he listened to both sides with the kind of patience that comes from years of sorting through competing versions of reality. Logan presented our evidence methodically. The geological surveys that had been ignored, the environmental concerns that had been dismissed, the procedural protocols that I'd followed exactly as trained. Clarice's lawyers tried to paint me as an unstable former employee, with a grudge against progress, but their argument fell apart when faced with 15 years of exemplary service records and safety commendations that they couldn't explain away. The judge dismissed the criminal damage lawsuit due to insufficient evidence, pointing out that opening floodgates during severe weather was not only legal but required by safety protocols. But he kept the case open for further investigation into proper dam operation procedures, which meant this wasn't over yet. I won that round, but I could see in Clarice's eyes that she was already planning her next attack. The kind of look that said she'd rather burn the whole town down than admit defeat to someone she considered beneath her social status. She didn't say anything to me as we left the courthouse, but her lawyers were already huddled together like generals planning the next phase of a war they intended to win at any cost. Logan walked me to my truck, looking worried, despite our legal victory, the kind of expression that said he knew something I didn't want to hear. "Roy, someone's been investigating your employment history and mental health records. They're building a case that you're unstable, that your actions were the result of psychological problems rather than professional judgment." I stared at my reflection in the truck's side mirror, wondering how far this woman was willing to go to destroy me completely. Clarice didn't flinch. She just stared at me like the game had just begun. Maybe it had. You ever see someone lose and still act like they're holding all the cards? The media attack campaign started the following week, and it was more coordinated and vicious than anything I'd expected from what I'd thought was just a local development dispute. Clarice had somehow convinced Brad Henley, a former coworker from my dam management days, to go on television and tell obvious lies about my professional record and personal stability. Watching Brad sit in that news studio, claiming I'd been always reckless with safety protocols and had anger management issues during my 15-year career, felt like being betrayed by someone I'd trusted with my life. Brad and I had worked together for over a decade, shared coffee breaks and birthday cakes, and the kind of workplace friendship that comes from solving problems together and watching each other's backs during emergencies. Now he was taking money to destroy my reputation on live television, probably telling himself it was just business, while he collected whatever fee Clarice was paying for purchase testimony. The local news ran a damaging story with the headline, "Former dam manager accused of sabotaging development, project mental health concerns raised," using the worst possible photo of me, something taken from the courthouse steps where I looked angry and disheveled after hours of legal proceedings. They paired it with footage of flooded construction sites and upset investors, making it look like I was some kind of unhinged eco-terrorist who'd snapped under pressure and decided to wage war against progress itself. The reporter made it sound like I was a ticking time bomb who'd been waiting years for an opportunity to cause maximum damage to innocent people trying to bring prosperity to our community. I watched that broadcast sitting in my living room, drinking coffee from a mug my grandfather had given me 30 years ago, and felt something break inside my chest that I didn't know how to fix or even name. The worst part was how quickly people believed every word of it, like they'd been waiting for confirmation that I was exactly the kind of person who'd do something crazy and destructive. Neighbors I'd known for years started crossing the street to avoid me, like they thought I might suddenly become violent or unpredictable without warning. The guy at the hardware store, someone who had helped me find parts for my dock repairs and always asked about fishing conditions, stopped making eye contact when I bought supplies and started treating me like a potential threat. Even the waitress at the diner, someone who'd been serving me coffee and pie for 3 years and knew I always left a decent tip, started acting nervous when I walked in, like she was afraid I might explode into rage without provocation. It was like I'd become a different person overnight, not Roy Callan, retired dam manager and grandson of a respected local family, but some kind of dangerous lunatic who couldn't be trusted around heavy machinery or polite society. For the first time since my father died, I found myself staring at the lake, not for comfort, but for an ending. Thought about selling vanishing. Thought maybe Clarice was right. Maybe I was just a bitter old man clinging to someone else's past. Maybe I should sell my grandfather's cabin for whatever money I could get, pack up my fishing gear and engineering maps, and find somewhere else to retire where nobody knew about lawsuits and property damage and mental health concerns. I started drinking bourbon in the evenings, sitting on my grandfather's old porch and wondering if I'd become the dangerous person they were describing on television, someone whose judgment couldn't be trusted and whose motives were suspect. The lake that had always been my sanctuary now felt like a mirror, reflecting back everything I'd apparently gotten wrong about my own life. Sometimes when you lose everything, you start to remember who you really are underneath all the doubt and fear. I thought you might be sitting here feeling sorry for yourself, Earl said, dropping the bottle on the table like a challenge. But this lake doesn't need a victim. It needs the man who used to command water like a conductor leads a symphony. Earl had brought a bottle of bourbon that was better than anything I could afford, and my original lake engineering surveys spread out like a treasure map to hidden possibilities. He settled into my grandfather's rocking chair, like he'd been invited to stay as long as necessary, and we spent the evening going through those surveys by candlelight, studying water flow patterns and underground channels and geological features that had been there for thousands of years before Clarice Vaughn was even born. Earl traced the routes with his weathered finger, asking questions about pressure readings and seasonal variations, like he was learning a foreign language that might save both our lives. Looking at those engineering maps in the flickering light, I realized I'd been thinking too small about what was really happening here. If Clarice wanted to play games with the entire lake ecosystem, maybe it was time to show her what the lake could really do when it stopped being patient with human stupidity and started asserting its natural authority. I spread out my most detailed geological survey maps across the kitchen table, studying underground water channels I'd never actually touched before, but understood better than anyone else alive. My finger traced deep flow patterns running directly under Clarice's main building foundation, calculating what would happen if those channels were restored to their original configuration after decades of human interference. Ever feel like something's been waiting decades for you to finally notice it? These channels weren't man-made, they were patient. You ever seen nature hold a grudge? If I was wrong about this, there wouldn't be any coming back from what happened next. But looking at Earl's weathered face in the candlelight, seeing the trust and determination in his eyes, I knew I couldn't back down now, even if it meant risking everything I had left to lose. The maps showed me something I'd never noticed before, a natural pressure system that ran deeper than anything I'd worked with during my 15 years managing surface water flow. This wasn't about opening valves or redirecting streams. This was about letting the earth remember how it used to breathe before concrete and construction plans tried to hold its breath forever. Earl poured another glass of bourbon and raised it like a toast. "To your grandfather," he said, "and to whatever comes next." I raised my glass and felt something settle in my chest that hadn't been there since this whole mess started. Not anger, not revenge, but purpose. Despite all the setbacks, legal battles, negative publicity, and character assassination that would have made any reasonable person reconsider their entire approach to business, Clarice secured new investors and announced Lake Haven Estates 2.0, an even larger project with 80 vacation rental cabins instead of the original 60. She was doubling down on her vision, with the kind of stubborn determination that comes from never having been told no by anyone who mattered, treating the previous flooding and construction problems as minor inconveniences that could be solved with more money and better engineering. She held a confident press conference standing on her flood-proof reinforced foundation, telling news cameras that the previous incidents were freak weather events that will never happen again, thanks to her improved drainage systems and state-of-the-art construction techniques. She called it underutilized land. I looked at the mud around her sinking empire and realized the lake didn't need defense. It needed a voice, and maybe I was finally willing to speak for it. The press conference was scheduled for a Friday afternoon with live television coverage and a group of potential investors who'd flown in from major cities to see Clarice's vision for luxury lakefront living that would supposedly transform our quiet lake into a profitable vacation destination. She wore a bright red suit that probably cost more than my truck, standing confidently beside construction equipment and foundation structures that her engineers promised were completely flood-resistant and designed to withstand any natural disaster Mother Nature could throw at them. The mayor was there, along with the county commissioner and several business leaders who talked about economic development and job creation like they were discussing a miracle cure for all the region's financial problems. I watched from the tree line hidden behind my grandfather's favorite oak tree and felt something cold and determined settle in my chest, like winter ice that wouldn't melt until justice was served. What Clarice didn't know, and what her expensive engineers had never bothered to investigate, was that I'd spent the previous week quietly removing construction debris and improperly placed fill dirt that her crews had dumped over natural underground water channels during their rush to build her empire. Using my deep geological knowledge from 15 years of dam management, I'd simply restored the land to its original natural state, clearing blockages and allowing water to flow through channels that had been there since the last ice age. I didn't break anything or sabotage equipment or do anything that couldn't be explained as environmental restoration. I just removed obstacles that were preventing the earth from behaving the way it always had before humans showed up with their construction plans. The excessive weight of Clarice's oversized construction, combined with underground water returning to its natural patterns, was going to create what engineers call differential settling. But that was nature's choice, not mine. As Clarice spoke confidently to the television cameras about her engineering improvements and state-of-the-art foundation systems that would supposedly last forever, I felt it, before I saw it, a shudder in the ground, like the lake had inhaled. Then came the sound, not a roar, but a groan deep and ancient, as the earth shifted and corrected a mistake. The ground beneath her main building literally began shifting and settling in slow motion. It wasn't dramatic or explosive, like something from a disaster movie, just a slow, inevitable response to geological forces that had been building pressure for months, while she ignored every warning sign nature had been sending. The foundation gradually tilted as underground water reclaimed its natural channels, and cabin structures started sinking slowly into the softening earth, like ships disappearing beneath the surface of a calm sea. It was like watching the land gradually swallow what was never supposed to be there in the first place, rejecting Clarice's vision with the patient persistence of geological time. One of the investors, a polished man in a pinstripe suit, stepped back from Clarice, shaking his head. "You didn't tell us the soil was reactive." He turned to the cameras. "We're pulling funding immediately." Clarice froze. For once, she had no line ready. The media coverage was incredible to watch, like seeing karma delivered in real time with professional cinematography. The same reporters who'd previously portrayed me as an unstable eco-terrorist now investigated and discovered that Clarice had cut corners on geological surveys, ignored environmental impact studies that clearly warned against dense construction, and apparently bribed local officials to approve her project despite obvious safety concerns that any competent engineer should have caught. The state environmental agency launched a criminal investigation into her business practices, and suddenly everyone wanted to interview the dam expert who tried to warn everyone about the dangers of building on unsuitable land. Clarice's total downfall was swift and comprehensive, like watching a house of cards collapse when someone finally pulls out the foundation. Completely bankrupt from failed construction and legal fees, facing multiple criminal charges for fraud and environmental violations, and abandoned by all her investors who wanted nothing to do with her toxic reputation, she quietly disappeared from Lake Haven one morning before dawn, like a criminal fleeing the scene of a crime. Clarice didn't scream, she didn't cry. She just stood neck deep in her own undoing, watching it all drift away. I happened to be out fishing early and saw her loading boxes into a moving truck, no longer the powerful woman who'd once threatened to own the entire lake and transform it into her personal profit center. She looked smaller somehow, diminished like someone who had finally run out of other people's money to spend on impossible dreams. I thought about walking over and saying something, maybe offering some kind of closure or final confrontation, but honestly, what was there left to say? 6 months later, I stood at the lake's edge watching the sunset paint the water, gold and orange, my hand touching the calm surface, like I was greeting an old friend who'd survived a terrible ordeal and come through stronger than before. Lake Haven had returned to its natural state, actually more beautiful than it had been before Clarice's interference with new wetland areas, where the construction had briefly stood, and wildlife returning in numbers I hadn't seen in years. The loons were back calling across the water in voices that seemed to celebrate the silence and the return of peace to their ancestral home. Earl stopped by most mornings for coffee, and we'd sit on the old dock in comfortable silence, watching the mist rise from the water and listening to the sounds of a place that remembered how to be itself again. The town council had officially designated Lake Haven as a protected natural area, ensuring no commercial development could ever threaten it again. I didn't cheer, I didn't gloat, I just stood there soaked and shaking, thinking about my grandfather's words, respect the water. It's older than all of us and far less forgiving. Clarice forgot that. A lot of people do. They try to bend the land to their will, slap a price tag on things that were never theirs to begin with. But nature has a way of remembering, and sometimes the strongest thing you can do is step aside and let it speak. If you're still here, I'd really like to know what this reminded you of, or what you would have done in my place. And hey, if this story hit something in you and you want to support the channel, that little thanks button's always there. Thanks for hanging out.
We're QA Stories, and this is just one of many unbelievable tales. Catch more by checking out the next video. We promise it's even wilder.